I know a lot of African Americans think about going to Africa. They hear that Africans don't like us. They call us Akadas. And how were you received when in different parts of Africa?
Mm-hmm.
And I got another question.
Okay. My first trip to Africa was to Dakar, Senegal. And I was 20 years old, maybe 19 or 20. I went as part of an exchange program through Sister Cities International. And so I went by myself. I was actually the only person from DC who went to Dakar. And I was received very warmly. I lived with families, and I was supposed to have a job. It never really materialized. I was just kind of sitting there. But I had a wonderful experience. I'll tell you that the one thing I remember vividly is when I was riding from the airport to the home where I was staying, I saw people carrying things on their heads. Bags, bundles, buckets, everything on their heads. And I had thought that was a negative stereotype. I thought when we saw those images, it was a degrading, that they were making that up to show us in a negative light, when in fact, that's the reality. That's how people move around. That's how they move their things. We carry them on our shoulders and on our backs. They carry them on their heads, and they stand very tall and regal, and it's beautiful. So I felt great. The other caveat to that, though, is that I spent a lot of time with college students that I had met when I was in school in France prior. So I felt accepted because these were my friends that I had made before. The next time I traveled to the continent was 25 years, 30 years later, something like, no, 30 years, 25 years later. And that was an equally as enlightening experience. This time I went with 50 Black folks who we had traced to the country of Cameroon for their ancestry. We all went to Cameroon. And that felt like the whole country was just one big welcome wagon. I mean, they were very excited for us to be there. They followed us in the media. So whenever the next place we were going, they knew we were coming. And everybody was gracious, and they just kept saying, "You're welcome, you're welcome, you're welcome." So of course, there are going to be some Africans that have a negative perspective of African Americans, just like there are plenty of African Americans who have a negative perspective of Africa. And I'll tell you, that's just part of the master plan. Just like we're fed negative images of them, they're fed negative images of us. There's so much power that's possible in our reconnecting that the people in power, the colonial powers, the colonizers, the white supremacists, whatever you want to call them, it's in their best interest for us to stay divided. And so as a result, they're going to stoke those flames of ignorance and lack of understanding between us. So when people say, well, Africans don't like us, I say that's hogwash.
In Africa, they have a lot of slave dungeons. Well, my cousin actually went to one in Senegal. He went to Gorée Island.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me that when he went there, that there were people still living on the island. And it's kind of like the people are disconnected from the transatlantic slave trade. And a lot of them don't really see how it relates to them, even though it's their ancestors too. Did you experience that?
I visited slave dungeons in 3 different countries, or areas that had slave dungeons in 3 different countries. I went to Gorée Island, like your cousin did, in Senegal. I went to Cape Coast Castle Dungeon in Ghana, and I visited Bimbia in Cameroon. I don't remember when I was a teenager. I don't remember the attitudes of the people around. I can't speak on that. When I went to Cameroon, we actually met with the local community. And they had what was almost like a reconciliation ceremony. They were never taught about what happened. So, of course they're going to be disconnected because they've never been taught. Just like there's so many things we aren't taught about who we are and our ancestors. And so once they were educated, they had this ceremony to apologize to us as the returning sons and daughters. And it was important for them to apologize to us for us and for them, if that makes any sense. And then when I visited the Cape Coast Castle Dungeon in Ghana, I visited with a lot of people. And there was only one or two Ghanaians with us. And so the feeling that I got from that experience was much more of the African American reaction to being in that space rather than the Ghanaian reaction. But I think it all just boils down to ignorance. They just didn't know. They just haven't been taught.
So, I just wanted to dispel those myths. I feel like they're kind of myths,
You're right. I agree. It's definitely a myth that, and you know what else? You didn't ask me this question, but one of the things that I think is becoming talked about more often is the idea that, and the reality that there were Africans that sold other Africans. And I feel like that's true. That's historical fact. But the context is often missing. So people tend to use that as an excuse almost for what we were talking about earlier in terms of Africans not liking African Americans and vice versa. The reality is they didn't know what they were selling their rivals into. It wasn't like they knew that they were going to go and they were never going to come back. And because there's been slavery all around the world forever. But the type of slavery that we ultimately were sold into was a new type of very vicious, horrible enslavement that I don't accept that they knew we were being sold into.
What was slavery like in Africa prior to that? You said it was, so was there was slavery there, what was it like?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on slavery in Africa, but what I do know anecdotally is that when people were sold or exchanged from between rival ethnic groups, the enslaved lived within the group as a real person. The enslaved person didn't live in bondage. The enslaved person was part of an active and part of the community in many cases. And the enslavement lasted for a period of time and then ended. And that person was free to go back to their original communities. That's one form of slavery that existed in Africa. I'm sure there are many different forms, but they certainly were not as vicious as what occurred during the transatlantic slave trade.